Welcome to the third dimension. In March 2023, the people of Yemen will enter the 9th year of conflict since its escalation in 2015. As of November 2022, the post-truce period remained relatively stable without any major escalation in hostilities or military operations. The United Nations brokered truce was an unexpected bright spot in a brutal 8-year conflict and gave ordinary people some respite from violence. But warring parties failed to extend the agreement, and 2023 is likely to hold more violence and humanitarian disaster for the country. To discuss this topic, join me from Cambridge, Professor Elizabeth Kindal. Professor Elizabeth Kindal is currently the Mistress of Girton College, Cambridge University, and is a Senior Fellow Researcher and Middle East Analyst. She has studied and researched Yemen intensively. Welcome to the third dimension, Professor Kindal.
Thank you.
Before getting into analysis of the dynamics of the Yemeni conflict, if I would just ask you straight away, when Professor Kindal hears Yemen, what springs to her mind?
What springs to my mind when I hear Yemen is a very warm, who have suffered greatly, but who've shown massive resilience. I'd also say the second thing that springs to mind is a country that has been ripped apart by conflict, that has many, many actors and is considerably more complicated than we often perceive it to be in the West.
How do you assess the current state of affairs in Yemen amid intensive international diplomacy in the region to revive the truce efforts?
The situation in Yemen is, as you say, undergoing intense international diplomacy currently. And I think we have to understand that there are many layers to this conflict, often missed in the West. So there is the international dimension. There's also, of course, the regional dimension, but there's a very strong domestic dimension and then also a very local dimension to the conflict. All of these need to be discussed and resolved. And I think one of the sad things right now is that despite all of the international diplomacy, there are moves on the ground to prepare for more rounds of war in case the diplomatic efforts don't work, and that's very worrying. Of course, there are talks that have been ongoing between the Saudis and directly with the Houthis, and even if these talks do come to some kind of agreement, of course, it's not going to solve the Yemen conflict, which was ultimately domestically generated. One has to bring the new Presidential Leadership Council into these talks at some point. And that looks difficult because although it looked very positive in the beginning, the formation of this Presidential Leadership Council, it is unstable. There's a lot of infighting and it's papering over many cracks in their perceptions of what they want their future Yemen to look like. And there are so many challenges facing the Yemeni government. It's not just about infighting within its own ranks, and of course, the biggest challenge of all, the Houthis, but there are so many other things. There's inflation, there's a shortage of food, there's the war economy, which continues to boom, infrastructure has been destroyed, ordinary foodstuffs are unaffordable, fuel is scarce, there's a water crisis that's looming in the distance, and there's a health and an education system that are not functioning brilliantly. So we have to hope that these current talks go somewhere, and we have to really hope that Oman can play some kind of role in bringing the sides together.
Okay, so as you have mentioned it now, the new mediation, the Omani mediation, etc., are you really optimistic that it can bring about some kind of compromise, Professor Kindal?
I would not call myself optimistic. I would rather describe myself as hopeful. We always have to have hope. But after 8 years of war, and approaching the 9th year of war, I think all sides have become entrenched. And the longer a conflict goes on, the more polarized the different actors become. So it's going to be incredibly challenging to find middle ground. And when you've been fighting your enemy for 8 long years, it's hard to sit around a table with them and discuss some kind of power sharing arrangement. So no, I'm not optimistic, but I always have hope.
Okay. So, Professor Kindal, if we move to some claims, there are claims that the international community is appeasing Houthis, okay? And this has led to a kind of, I would call it a kind of a predicament to peace efforts. And not only this, it has made the rebels take the international community for granted. How far those claims stand valid, Professor?
Well, I certainly understand the basis for these claims. And I think it's easy to associate the increasing Houthi strength with attempts by the international community to find a peace agreement. But I wouldn't say that the international community is appeasing the Houthis, at least not intentionally. I think we're conflating or confusing a couple of issues here. The international community desires to avoid deaths, including deaths in Houthi areas. And that, of course, means continuing to try to prevent full-scale military attacks in those areas by the Saudi-led coalition that harm civilians, and also by continuing to try to get aid through into Houthi areas. But that should not be mistaken for appeasing the Houthis. And on the other side, the international community, at least the international media, is very critical of human rights violations by the Saudi-led coalition. And that's understandable because we sell weapons to the Saudi-led coalition.
True.
But that doesn't mean, and they are many, it's simply that we don't sell weapons to the Houthis. So they perhaps receive less attention. They don't get the same press coverage. I also think it's true to say that the Houthis have had better public relations and media in the war than have the Saudi side, probably because it makes an easier story to sell in the West, to show pictures of thin children, starving babies, and then to blame it all on the Saudi-led coalition. It's easy to digest. It's a result of airstrikes. But this is, of course, very one-sided. And it misses the point that even when food and medicine and fuel does get into Yemen and does avoid and get through the Saudi blockade, it's then held up by the Houthis, who control roadblocks, who tax some of the incoming goods, and who have also been accused of hoarding medicine and food and using it as leverage for political and military support in the war. So it is, of course, a much more complicated picture than we see. But I should mention that Western governments are in a difficult situation here. They have a real dilemma, and it's hard to see how this can be solved. Because do you let the Houthis have some control over the aid that enters their areas, or do you simply let people starve? Do you give the Houthis a voice in the peace talks, or do you support a governance system for the future that completely shuts them out? Of course, they are part of the fabric. So, the bottom line is that the Houthis do need to be part of a political solution. They can't just be bombed into oblivion.
Yes. Perhaps what you talked about, the international community's, I would say, dilemma, as you called it, it can appear now when we used to have what we call a UN peace process track. Now this track is being replaced by an Omani track, Professor Kindal. Yes? Does it show also?
Yes, Yes, I think that's true. I think the UN track has reached a bit of a dead end. And in one way, the good intentions of the United Nations keep backfiring. When there were the talks in Stockholm in 2018, everyone celebrated the Hudaydah agreement because It looked like there was a ceasefire that might then be rolled out to the rest of Yemen. And the reality was that it didn't really work. And all it did was give the Houthis an opportunity to rebuild their forces. Even the truce that was brokered last year by the United Nations, it was great. It worked for 6 months in terms of lowering the number of deaths and giving some breathing space, but it didn't lead to all-out talks. And nearly all of the concessions for the truce were given by the Saudi-led coalition. They weren't reciprocated by the Houthis. We have an expression in English: every time you give an inch, they take a mile. And that feels like how it's happened with the Houthis.
True. Okay. Before I leave the point of appeasement, claims of appeasement, Professor Kindal, if I just take you back to the implementation of the truce that was expired, okay, lifting restrictions on Sana'a airport, Hodeida's port, all these things, and the international community failed to pressure the Houthis to open just one single road in Taiz. So how do you interpret this, Professor?
Well, it's very disappointing, but you're right. The Houthis did not keep their promises under the truce. And it was true that Sana'a airport reopened, perhaps not to the extent that the Houthis had hoped, but the Houthis were supposed to open roads around Taiz. They didn't, and they kept stalling. And then they said, well, we won't open these roads, we'll open these other roads, very minor roads, which didn't really help the situation or would not have helped. And every time the Houthis were given a concession, they simply wanted more. In the end, the Houthis were demanding that the personnel, civil servants, and even military people in the areas under their control would be paid. So by the other side and by the international community. So it really looked like the Houthis were not in a mood for peace. Now, how do I explain that? I can only say that it looks like the Houthis feel that they have the upper hand and that they don't want peace, that they feel that they can just keep going on in the war indefinitely and reaching more and more demands.
Okay, so if I may take you now away from the dynamics of the Yemeni conflict into academic interests, Professor Kindal, and specifically your interest in the jihadist literature, very striking, okay? So I quote you, you say, my current passion is exploring how militant jihad groups use soft culture, poetry, literature, songs, and harness local grievances, not only to recruit, but equally crucially, to win toleration in the broader community. Believe it or not, Professor Kindal, when I was reading your quote, it came to my mind the jihadist, and it came to my mind also what the Houthis do. So how do you react to this?
I think I agree with you. I think that the Houthis do this very well. And of course, we in the West don't really notice it because we're not the target market. But I have dozens of feeds on my Telegram accounts where I get Houthi zawamil every day coming through.
Yes.
They're really good at producing this kind of material. And so the kinds of public relations exercises that some of the more mainstream state actors in the war use, expensive agencies with wonderful public relations that perhaps get their story across in the West, they don't work on the ground. They don't function to win hearts and minds on the ground in the same way that this very authentic material that's produced by groups like the Houthis or Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula works. They are good at producing poems, so either zawamil or qasaid, and also nasheeds.
Yes.
These are great ways of getting catchy slogans out to the public, and relentless, especially when they've got films with them and you see combat and fighting. It pumps people up and it really influences the youth generation. And that's important because if you infect young minds, then we know it's going to be a long war.
True. And by the virtue of your position, Professor Kindal, you said perhaps Western governments are not aware of this kind of threat. By the virtue of your position, do you play a kind of role here to create a kind of awareness that Houthis are really, I would say, poisoning generations and generations in Yemen with their sectarian ideology, I mean?
I have a role in bringing to public attention in my country and the international community some of the work that I find and the analysis that I do. Now, most of my own focus of my academic work is on what we call Al-Qaeda, although there are arguments about what that really means. But I have also mentioned and explored in meetings the similarities with the Houthi movement in terms of this kind of cultural production. But it's hard to focus minds here on material which is very alien and for which we're just not the target market. So it's a difficult line. Most people here are much more interested in how many weapons do they have, what are they planning, and they're less interested in how are they feeling, what are they thinking, how are they getting into young minds. But of course, those latter questions are incredibly important for safeguarding the future and for getting any kind of sustainable solution to the conflict. One of the areas I think we're not very good at focusing on are the unseen results of the conflict, the unseen consequences. So while it's easy to see a building that's been bombed or people who have been killed, it's much less easy to see the influences that are happening inside young people's minds. And here is where education and rebuilding the education system and trying to make it more objective and fit for purpose and less ideological, particularly in the Houthi areas, this needs to be watched, this needs to be monitored, and it needs to be Yemenis and a Yemeni solution to their future problems, and not something that we go in and try to do.
Okay, so another interesting point in your career, Professor Kindal, is your strong bonds with the tribal community in Yemen, referring to your contribution in establishing the cross-tribal council in Al-Mahra. Why specifically you chose Al-Mahra, governorate, okay? Would you please tell us more about this?
I became very interested in Al-Mahra, partly because I was looking for poetry and it's a very rich area for poetry, and partly because I had met Mahris, particularly in Oman, who fed my interest in Al-Mahra. And it seemed like a very remote and exciting place to get to know and to travel in. There weren't many people paying any attention to this eastern part of the country, yet it has a very important geostrategic position, sitting there with a 300-kilometer border to Oman and a very long coastline of over 500 kilometers. In quite a difficult and important area, it has a maritime coastline to Somalia. So I thought this would be an exciting place to work. The council that I helped to establish has subsequently morphed into an NGO, more of a charity, a non-governmental organization that focuses on development. And the idea is, together with local people, the drivers are very much local, is to try to find solutions locally that work bottom up, not top down, so that they have a chance of taking root, taking control of their future, and to base the work that we do there, we meaning the NGO, the non-governmental organization, the charity, to base that work on what people themselves want and not on some preconceived idea that's dreamt up in an office in London or Washington.
Yeah. During that experience, Professor Kindal, I understand you associated also with Yemeni women, and you still have memories of that. Now, how do you see Yemeni women nowadays under Houthi repressive measures male guardianship, restriction of movement, to ban travel, etc. How do you feel about it?
Well, it's very disappointing to see the limitations that are being placed, not just on women in whose the areas, but on journalists, on minorities, on any dissenting voices. It's a supremacist mindset which doesn't have room for people who think in a different way. My experience of Yemeni women in the east of the country is that they have a huge amount to contribute, that they're feisty, they have opinions, and of course there are a whole range of opinions. We often talk about women as though they're one thing, but of course there are as many ranges of opinions amongst the women as there are amongst the men. So it would be a really sad situation if half of the population, the female half, isn't listened to and isn't involved in Houthi areas, if they're not actively part of a solution of political life, of social life, of cultural life. In my studies of Islam, what the Houthis are teaching does not sound Islamic to me.
Right. Professor Keyndal, now from that debate about women, etc., what is your message to the warring parties in Yemen?
My message to the warring parties in Yemen, that's a difficult question. I think it's to listen more and to dictate less, and to think about the future of your own children and grandchildren, and not just the immediate future of tomorrow and your own power. This is really addressed to leaders. It's very easy to get into a rut where war becomes a way of life and you can't see beyond it. In fact, I should just add that when women are involved in helping to navigate and negotiate peace processes, those peace processes are 35% more likely to be sustainable than they are without the involvement of women. I would also say to the warring parties, think more about representation, because if you are going to make peace and sign an agreement, it needs to be received well on the ground. And that's quite difficult when people feel very alienated from those elites who are in power. And my final point would be, I think that the international community can help with this, but it needs to be to start rebuilding Yemen now, to start thinking about a robust education system, about healthcare services, about building institutions and building representation, not even necessarily democracy, but just representation, so that people have a future to aspire to. And we can't just wait for the war to end.
Okay. And in the end, what about your message to the vulnerable Yemenis, those Yemenis you shared with them food one day, you shared with them shelter, conversations, etc. What do you say to vulnerable Yemenis, Professor Keyndal?
Well, it's hard to know what to say to vulnerable Yemenis when I'm in a privileged position of sitting safely here in the United Kingdom. It feels wrong to be saying anything except for, although international attention has diminished in Yemen, particularly with other crises around the world like Afghanistan or Ukraine, there are many, many people sitting here who do think about Yemen, desperately want the war to end, and who follow the hashtag Yemen can't wait. I mean, it's true, Yemen can't wait, and who really feel that there is some light somewhere at the end of the tunnel. Wars don't go on forever.
Definitely. That brings us, with that remark, we come to the end of this interview. In fact, that debate was quite interesting, Professor Keyndal, and it's really nice to have you on Yemen Today TV. Perhaps we can see you all the time on Yemen Today TV talking to Yemenis for the first time through a Yemeni media and not international or Arab media.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you.
It's been my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's all for this time. Thank you for watching. See you next week with a new edition of The Third Dimension.